Utah Territory, autumn of 1887. The high desert had the color of old coins and the hush of a church after the hymn. Sage wore a dusting of gold light. Basalt buttes rose like broken teeth against a sky that had not decided whether to be blue or brass. Far off, a train put a seam of smoke across the horizon and left the land exactly as it found it. Wide, indifferent, and old enough to remember the hoofbeats of men who thought they were permanent. On the flats east of Willow Draw, the ground bore a darker mark. A charred furrow a man could follow for miles with the toe of his boot. It cut the country like the stroke of a burned quill. On one side, the Barsea spread grays and fenced, water rights inked in Cheyenne, backed by rifles. On the other, the open draw on the track to Cedar Butte, where the stray and the unwanted drifted when they had nowhere else to be. Folks called it a line. They said crossing it with the wrong purpose hollowed a life out the way locusts hollowed a wheat field. He had heard worse names for the same idea. If this opening pulled you in, hit like and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. It helps us bring more quiet Western stories to life. The rider came alone, moving the way a hurt man learns to move, like weather, slow, sure, unafraid of the miles. They called him Cole Maddox now. Somewhere in another state, where the rivers ran with cottonwood shade and the hill grass burned blonde in August, he had been someone else's son. But names were thin on the edges out here. What lasts is what you do when the wind turns and the water runs out. He kept the brim of his hat low and his thoughts lower, pacing the bay, gelding along the long seam of that burned furrow. On his left, wind combed the pasture that wasn't his. On his right, the draw fell toward dry willows braided with a trickle of water. Above him, hawks wrote spirals no court could read. The shoulder he'd ruined as a boy. Chasing a skittish filly through shale and falling farther than legs can learn, had a way of waking the cold and telling the day's weather before the day had opinions. He let it ache. Pain is another trail sign on country like this. A man uses it to know where not to put his weight. He remembered the voice that had put a warning under his ribs and left it there. Not the sheriff. Not a ranch boss. A woman's, low, even, like rain when you hear it before you feel it. If you cross that line, you'll never come back. She had said it without threat or prayer. Only knowledge. Some truths wore no decorations. He remembered, too, the first line he ever crossed without understanding the cost. It wasn't barbed wire or fence posts. It was a river in flood under the red bluffs of his childhood, foam gathering against willow roots. Spring mean as a kick dog. His father had said the ford would hold. His mother had tied her kerchief tight and smiled a small, brave smile that belonged to another life. They drove the wagon in. The first wheel lifted. Then the whole world tilted, and the river's hands were bigger than theirs. Water remembers. It does not ask. The river took the wagon, and the little cedar chest with the letters his mother kept, and the sorrel mare that hated thunder. It left a boy with mud in his teeth and a silence in his chest that never quite filled again. He stood on the bank that day with the water draining from his boots and learned how a map of a life is inked. Not with destinations, but with places where you do not return. Years have been laid like boards between then and now. But boards rot in time. He still felt the give. Cole put the past where he put most things he couldn't fix, behind his breath, under his ribs. He turned the bay toward Willow Draw. The settlement had never bothered to pretend to be a town. 3 roofs, a well, a scatter of cottonwood leaves that knew how to show yellow, a dry goods room that doubled as a meeting hall when weather cornered people into remembering they were neighbors. A camp stove smell lingered by the well. Laundry lines ticked in the low wind. On the bench by the doorway sat the woman who gave the warning. She'd been on the bench yesterday and the day before, never idle, always busy with some small mending that mattered to somebody. Her hair had learned to be practical long ago. Her posture taught the same lesson. Her eyes were river-colored on a day when the storm had decided to keep its temper to itself. She had said the line would take him. She had not said it unkindly. Cole didn't tie off at the well. He drank from his hat brim, gave the bay his share, and kept his questions folded the way a man keeps letters he's not ready to read. The draw had a way of telling what you needed if you listened to the wind properly. Today the wind carried more than the smell of dust. It carried worry. A worry made of hoof prints and the way cottonwoods will go still when they feel a thing coming through their roots. By sundown, the sky had learned to wear color again. Iron first, then violet. Then an ember's last whisper of orange lifted under the far bluff. Cole counted the new shadow moving along the far margin of the bar sea. 3 riders, then 5. The ranch didn't ride that line hard, unless something of theirs had gone missing, or something not theirs had strayed over. In the valley between, a single ribbon of smoke lifted from the lower willows of the open side. Willow draw folks rarely stove at the creek. It gave men who patrol lines the wrong ideas. But necessity ignores custom. That smoke said fire, and fire at the water's edge said someone was either cold or careless. Cold people try to live. Careless people get other people killed. Cole let the bay find his footing among the saltbush and driftwood. The creek talked in pebble syllables. He read the ground where he could, and guessed where he couldn't. In the flicker of the little fire sat a boy with a blanket around his shoulders and the fixed, too bright stare of the sick or the scared. Beside him, a woman worked a kettle with hands that knew how to keep heat where heat belonged. She kept one eye on the boy and the other on the line. A third pair of boots lay by the fire, as if someone had taken them off in a hurry and not found time to put them back on. Cole didn't speak. Saying a thing out loud in the open country sometimes feeds it. He took a slow measure of the curve of shadow beyond the willows and the flattened grass, where a body had fallen and gotten up or had been dragged. The river took and returned according to its old laws. People were worse arbiters. He let the horses wait announce him. The woman's shoulders lifted, then settled again when all she heard was the click of a curb chain and the slow exhale of a gelding that had seen more nights than candles. The boy was trouble and not at the same time. Fever has its own shine. His skin wore it. He watched the fire like people do when what's inside them is colder than their coats can fix. The woman kept her kettle over the edge of the flame, where the boil turns to steam without anger. She gave water to the boy in sips and watched him count them in his mind. From the shadows, a cough. Then a man's breath cut into pieces. She looked toward the sound and did not go. People learn the cost of movement. They choose stillness when the arithmetic works out cruel. Cole slid from the saddle, left the reins loose, and brought the slow quiet of his presence close to the fire. The woman's eyes took him the way a river gauges a stranger. Depth, speed, what will drown and what will carry. She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. Wind rode a soft hand through the willow leaves. Far off, a chain jingled. The riders who patrolled the far side of the line had better horses than conscience. Their tacks sang a note that didn't belong to this draw. It would arrive before dawn. He read the ground again. The boy had come with the man. The woman had met them at the water, not by plan, but by old promise. There's always someone who waits near a creek with boiled towels and a pan when life goes wrong quickly. The third pair of boots meant another body once near the fire. The empty place where the grass hadn't stood up yet said he had been carried or fled or died, where the water could hide the stubbornness of death from a boy. Cole found the fourth shape, a satchel tucked beneath a willow root. When he moved his boot, the moon threw a flat light across its leather. A doctor's bag or a preacher's. He nudged it open with 2 fingers. Glass winked. A corked file. A folded paper with directions written in a clerk's hand who had never worked a shovel. Fever powders. Laudanum. The mercies and the failures of the age. He remembered his mother's hands when the river let him go. How they had not been there. He remembered the dry place in his chest where gratitude had wanted to bloom and found salt. He put the satchel back where the willow could pretend it had always been. The boy's breathing climbed a rung up a ladder no one wanted him to reach. The woman set a wet cloth to his neck and temple. The boy watched her with the same trust he would give the moon's face if it leaned close enough to carry him. Beyond the line, horses took a new rhythm. The canter men use when they are certain no one will question their reason later. The Barcy had a right to ride. Rights rarely came alone. They traveled with habits and the forgotten stories of what had been taken to make them holy. Cole felt the old heat stir under the cold that lives in a man who has lived long enough to call himself careful. It wasn't anger. It was its older cousin. The ache of recognizing a story repeating and knowing your body was the only mark you could make on the page. The woman watched him decide. He didn't weigh the sentence of her earlier warning against the weight of the boy's breath. Warnings have their place. Breath is more. He picked up the boy. The woman took the kettle off the fire and dropped the embers flat under her boot heel. She smothered the little blaze the way you close the eyes of a man you can't carry. No smoke rose, only the smell of heat leaving. Cole settled the boy in front of his saddle, felt the weight of a small world lean against his coat, and turned the bay toward the line. The gelding flicked an ear, found room for the extra heartbeat against his shoulder, and moved. The woman walked. Lines aren't real until you ask them to let you cross. Then they become as real as a noose. The Barcy riders brought the noise of iron and intention. Cole let the bay's hooves take the charred furrow at a quiet, steady walk. He had discovered years ago that slow courage holds longer than fast rage. He didn't look at the men with rifles on the other side. He looked at the boy's eyelids, fluttering like moth wings. He heard a voice say something about trespass and penalties, and the cost of teaching people how to ignore fences. He heard another voice say the boy carried the fever, and the fever belongs on the poor side of the world, because the rich side has fancier headstones to polish. He heard the woman say nothing at all. When the first rider put his horse across the furrow, Cole kept coming. Some men do not understand an answer until it is the only thing left in the room. He let the bay's shoulder touch the other horse's stirrup and did not look away. The rider took the look meant for him and gave back a different one. The look of a man who has been given orders and finally decides he would rather disappoint a boss than the person inside his boot heels. They parted, not for law, for something older. That is how the crossing happened. No gallop, no shouted defiance, no pistol lifted. Only a man carrying a boy with a borrowed heat, and a woman walking beside a creek that knew all the news before the town did. They made the ridge as the first color came back to the sky. The little clinic in Cedar Butte had a window that caught dawn and a table that remembered harder work than a child's fever. The doctor's mouth had the angry set of someone who had buried his son and taken the next century personally. He took the boy from Cole's arms without ceremony and turned competence into grace with a matter-of-fact ritual of basins, cloths, powders, and patience. Cole stood in the doorway and watched the way the woman held still while her whole soul moved. He remembered his mother's kerchief, tight under her chin above the river. He remembered nothing after that, but cold and a long time spent learning how to speak to horses better than to people. Through the next hours, the fever broke and returned and broke again. It found no new purchase. By afternoon, the boys slept like boys do when their bodies finally believe the debt has been paid for the day. The woman sat with her hands idle for the first time since the fire. When she lifted her eyes to Cole, what lived were simple. Not thanks, not apology, not awe, only recognition. She had seen a man cross the line that keeps a life small. She knew how much that costs. Evening brought wind that grained the clinic window with dust. He could have left then. Men like him leave when the light is thin. It keeps the clean edges of a story intact. But he stayed long enough to check the bay's feet, give him nose-to-nose talk, and fold a note under his saddle, string the way a boy folds a drawing into a Bible. You've carried worse. I know. Thank you. At dusk, he climbed the ridge and let the land remind him how to be quiet again. The charred furrow below still cut the earth. It would for years. Grass would attempt to fill it, bravely and then convincingly. But roots remember where fire has lain. The woman's warning drifted up from yesterday. If you cross that line, you'll never come back. He understood now that she had not meant geography. The town and the draw went about its small business. Lanterns lifted, bread broken. A piano's one good key finding the same song it found every evening. On the far pasture, Barcy riders pace their own circuits, counting cattle-away priests count souls. Cole touched the brim of his hat to the north in the past, and the place in the river where the bank gives without warning. He let himself remember his parents out loud. The way a man uses a name on an empty trail to keep fear from forming bigger shadows. He said them both once, quiet, and did not crumble. Some griefs become scaffolding if you lean into them properly. Night came on like a blanket shaken out by a careful hand. Stars kindled in their old order. Coyotes wrote a thin script on a ridge and then thought better of it. Somewhere, the train stitched another length of track through the dark, indifferent as arithmetic. He rode back toward the charred furrow and stopped with the burned earth met clean. He dismounted and stood with one boot on each side, not because drama required it, but because some vows belong to ground more than to words. He didn't swear to become a better man or to go make amends town by town for the times. He had chosen the smaller life. He promised something humbler and heavier, to notice where the lines were and to cross them when someone's breath weighed more than someone else's paper. Morning found him gone from Cedar Butte. The draw kept its secrets the way it had kept its water. People told a version of the story that fit their mouths. Some said he had slipped north to Wyoming where the snow lives longer on the fence wire. Others said he took work down by the rail and let noise replace memory. A few said he circled back to a river he knew and decided to stand on the bank until it gave his parents back. Stories require furniture. They hate empty rooms. The boy lived. He learned to go easy around willows. He grew tall enough to see over the counter of the dry goods where he later stacked coffee tins, and then taller than the men who came to argue over nails. When he had his own son, he kept him from the water in spring and from the kind of men who ride boundaries and forget they're not God. In late summers, he'd ride a circle that touched the charred furrow and lay his palm to the ground without explaining why. Some prayers do not need instruction. The woman stayed near the well. She made soups with more time than the recipe asked and tied back hair for new mothers when the wind put grit in everything. When strangers came hungry, she found a second bowl. When lonely men came mean, she found the door and shut it. She never again told someone not to cross. She asked instead, "For who?" The Barcy replaced their riders one by one. The boss lived to be ornery and then died in his chair on a warm day with a cold eye. The line kept its scar until spring rolled a flood over it, and the desert decided it had made its point. Cole Maddox's name went thin around the edges, and then disappeared from talked away pencil marks fade when hands worry a page. But now and then, when the train cut its seam across the far flats at dusk and smoke laid a gentle blue over the basin, an old hand would tap his pipe clean on his boot and say he once saw a man carry a boy across fire in full view of rifles and call it nothing. Someone younger would snort and ask for dates and proof. The old man would shrug. Dates make poor saddles. Proof can't be bothered to ride. What remains is a choice, a line under starlight, a boy's breath counting itself back into the world, a woman's warning let down easy and left at the edge of a creek. What remains is a rider whose loss taught him the shape of absence and whose courage taught him the weight of presence. He did not become famous. He did not become forgiven. He became, on the days he could manage it, the kind of man who notices where another life begins to drown and gives up one more piece of his own dry ground. On windless evenings, when the land holds its breath just before the dark, Willow Draw still feels like a page turned carefully. The well chain ticks. Cottonwood leaves make the sound of a dress being lifted from a chair. Somewhere a hawk folds its wings and chooses a branch it has chosen before. And a line, any line, every line, waits for the next quiet crossing that will not be written in any book, except the one the country keeps under its ribs for men and women who remember which side of the world the breath belongs on.